Welcome to the Briarwood Cemetery murder. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1. The Daughter's Grief. There are mornings in London when the city seems reluctant to wake, when the October fog presses against the window panes of Baker Street like the palm of a cold hand, and the world beyond the glass retreats into a grey anonymity that swallows sound and light alike. It was upon such a morning, in the autumn of 1893, that I descended from my bedroom to find Sherlock Holmes already seated at the chemistry table, bent over a row of glass dishes containing samples of dark, granular earth. He had not slept. That much was evident from the stains of chemical reagent upon his dressing gown, and the cold pipe that rested, long extinguished, in the dish beside his elbow. His thin, hawk-like face was drawn in concentration, and he did not look up as I entered. "You are earlier than usual, Watson," he said, without raising his eyes. "The ache in your shoulder woke you. The barometric pressure has dropped sharply. Rain before midday, and your old wound is a more reliable instrument than any barometer in the city." I'd been rubbing my shoulder as I came down the stairs, and I abandoned the effort with a grunt of resignation. "What on earth are you doing with all that soil?" I asked, settling into my chair and reaching for the morning paper. "An experiment in decomposition rates," he replied, lifting one of the dishes to the light. "Cemetery earth, Watson. 6 samples from 6 London churchyards, each of varying acidity and mineral composition. And I'm testing the hypothesis that certain soils preserve organic traces longer than others, a matter that may prove useful in determining time of burial in cases where the date is disputed." He set the dish down and fixed me with a sharp glance. "You will find a notice in that paper, on page 4, which may interest you. An obituary." I turned to the indicated page and found, tucked between a notice for a retired naval captain and an announcement regarding the dissolution of a Cheapside brokerage, a brief paragraph: "Holloway. On the 15th of October, at Briarwood Cemetery. Highgate, Mr. Cedric Arthur Holloway, aged 58, retired solicitor and trustee of the Briarwood Cemetery Restoration Fund. Of heart failure. Funeral arrangements to follow." "Heart failure," I read aloud. "An elderly gentleman in a cemetery in October. Sad. But hardly remarkable." "Precisely what the police believe," said Holmes. He had returned to his soil samples, but there was something in his tone, a tautness, a thread of anticipation that I had learned to recognize. It was the sound of a mind that had already begun to work upon a problem that had not yet been formally presented to it. Before I could press the matter further, we were interrupted by the sound of the front door, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice on the stair, and then a rapid, uneven tread that spoke of agitation barely restrained. Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door with an expression she reserved for visitors who arrived in states of visible distress. "A young lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. A Miss Holloway. She is... well, sir, she is quite beside herself." Holmes's eyes met mine for the briefest instant. Then he rose, swept the soil samples to one side with a practised motion and said, "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps a pot of tea, the stronger Sam. Aye, if you would. I suspect our visitor has not eaten this morning." The woman who entered our sitting room was young, no more than 28, and dressed entirely in black. Her mourning was fresh and unrelieved by any ornament save a small brooch at her throat, which caught the firelight as she moved. She was pale, with dark eyes reddened by weeping, but fierce with an intensity that went beyond ordinary grief. She carried herself with the brittle composure of a person who has resolved not to break down, and who is maintaining that resolution by the narrowest of margins. "Miss Holloway," said Holmes, indicating the basket chair nearest the fire. "Please sit down. You have had a difficult journey from Islington this morning, and I imagine the cab was cold." She started visibly. How did you know I came from Islington?" "Your gloves bear the mark of the Islington Hansom Company, a small ink stamp on the interior wrist, where drivers mark their regular customers for the discount fare. You are a regular customer because you live locally, and yet you have come to Baker Street, which suggests the urgency of your errand outweighs the expense of the distance. But please sit and tell me why you have come." She sat, though she perched upon the edge of the chair as if prepared to spring up again at any provocation. Her hands twisted in her lap, and I noticed the calluses on her fingertips, and the faintest residue of rosin upon her left hand, the marks of a string player, almost certainly a violinist. Holmes had noticed it too. I saw his gaze linger there for an instant before moving on. "Mr. Holmes, my father was murdered." She said it flatly, as a statement of fact, and with none of the uncertainty or pleading that so often accompanies such declarations. It was not an appeal, it was a conviction. "Your father," said Holmes, being the late Mr. Cedric Holloway, whose obituary appeared in this morning's Times. "You have read it then you know what they are saying. Heart failure. A man who collapses in a cemetery on a cold night. What else would one think?" Her voice trembled, but held. "But they are wrong, Mr. Holmes. My father did not simply die. Someone killed him, and I will not rest until I know who and why." Holmes leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, that characteristic posture that I had come to associate with the most concentrated form of his attention. "Tell me everything, Miss Holloway. Begin with your father, who he was, and what had changed in recent weeks." She drew a breath and steadied herself. "My father was a solicitor, retired these last 3 years. A good man, Mr. Holmes. Not perfect, not a saint, but decent and honest in his dealings. After my mother died 4 years ago, he devoted himself to 2 things: his visits to her grave in Briarwood Cemetery, and his work as chief trustee of the Cemetery Restoration Fund. It gave him purpose. He walked to the cemetery nearly every night, always with his flask of brandy, a small ritual, a comfort. He would sit by my mother's grave and talk to her. The groundskeeper, Mr. Marsh, knew his routine." "And recently? Yeah, you said something had changed." Her jaw tightened. "In the past fortnight, my father became a different man. He was anxious, secretive. He locked his study door. He had never done that before. He barely ate. When I pressed him, he said only—" She paused, and I saw the effort it cost her to repeat the words. "There is a rot in Briarwood, Eleanor, and it goes deeper than the graves." Holmes did not move, but I felt the quality of his attention sharpen, as one feels a change in the air before a storm. He would not explain further, he asked. No, he said it was a matter he had to deal with himself, and that he would tell me everything when it was resolved. That was 4 days ago. 2 days later, he was found dead beside my mother's mausoleum, with his flask open on the ground and a peaceful expression on his face. And Inspector Lestrade told me my father died because his heart gave out in the cold. Her composure finally cracked, and her voice rose. "My father walked that cemetery in every kind of weather for 4 years, Mr. Holmes. His heart did not simply stop. Someone stopped it for him." There was a silence. The fire popped and settled. Holmes sat very still, his grey eyes fixed upon our visitor with an expression I knew well. He was reading her as another man might read a page of print. "Miss Holloway," he said at length, "I observe that you are a music tutor, the violin, unless I'm mistaken. That you are intimate with a gentleman whose rooms are in Lincoln's Inn, judging by the cab receipt visible in your bag, and the cologne upon your collar, which is not your own. And that there is something beyond your father's death that you are concealing from me, some matter that causes you to look away and to the left each time I approach the subject of the evening hours." She had gone very white. "Mr. Holmes, He raised a hand. "I do not require an explanation at this moment. You're entitled to your secrets, Miss Holloway, as all of us are. I merely note that you possess them because it tells me something important about you." He paused. Liars who hire detectives are either very foolish or very frightened. I rather think you are the latter. She said nothing. Her hands had stopped moving. She stared at him with an expression that mingled fear with something very close to relief. The relief of being seen, even partially by someone capable of seeing. "I will take your case," said Holmes, rising from his chair. "Not because I am certain your father was murdered. The evidence for that has yet to be established. I take it because the police are certain he was not, and certainty without investigation is the most dangerous form of ignorance there is." He crossed to the window and stood for a moment, gazing out at the fog-choked street below. When he turned back, his expression had changed. The languid posture of the consulting detective at rest was gone. In its place was the taut, alert bearing of a hound that has caught a scent. "Watson," he said, and his voice carried that particular ring of suppressed energy that never failed to quicken my pulse. "Fetch your coat and your revolver. We are going to a cemetery, and I rather suspect we shall find more than the dead." I set down my newspaper, finished my tea in a single draught, and went to prepare myself. Behind me, I heard Holmes's voice, gentler now, addressing Miss Holloway. "One last question, Miss Holloway. Your father's flask, the brandy he carried to the cemetery. Do you know what kind it was?" "An Armagnac," she said, without hesitation. "A very old one. He had it from a specialist importer. He was particular about it, dreadfully particular. He always said no other spirit tasted right." "Dreadfully particular," Holmes repeated softly. "Yes, I rather thought he might be." He said nothing more, but as I returned with my coat and revolver, I caught the faintest suggestion of a smile upon his lips. Not a smile of amusement, but of recognition. The smile of a man who has perceived the first faint outline of a pattern in what others see only as darkness. We left Baker Street at 10:15, the three of us stepping into the cold October morning, and the fog closed behind us like a curtain falling upon the first act of a play whose ending none of us could yet foresee. Our hashtag Chapter 2, The Silent Grave. Briarwood Cemetery announced itself long before one reached its gates. The cab turned off the Highgate Road into a narrow lane bordered by elms whose bare branches interlocked overhead like the ribs of some great decaying cathedral, and the air changed, grew heavier, colder, saturated with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. The fog here assumed a character of its own. It moved through the trees in slow tendrils, curling around headstones and draping itself across the iron railings, as though it had been resident in this place far longer than any of the dead. Holmes and I arrived at the cemetery gates shortly after 1 o'clock and found them standing open, their ironwork streaked with verdigris and beaded with moisture. Beyond them, the gravel path wound between rows of crooked headstones that listed at various angles, sinking into the mossy earth like vessels slowly foundering. Yew trees stood at intervals, ancient and darkly luxuriant, and among them the lesser monuments, urns, crosses, weeping angels with eroded faces, emerged from the fog and receded again as we passed. Inspector Lestrade was waiting at the Holloway mausoleum, his expression one I had observed many times, professional irritation warring with grudging acknowledgement that the situation had escalated beyond his preference. "Mr. Holmes," he said, bracing himself. I might have known Miss Holloway would bring you into this. I'll save you the trouble. The man died of heart failure. He was 58, wandered about in the cold at 4 a.m, and his heart stopped." "It does indeed happen," said Holmes pleasantly. "Almost as often as murder." Lestrade's moustache twitched, but he stepped aside. The Holloway mausoleum was a striking piece of work. White marble, conspicuously well maintained among the general decay, like with the family name carved in Roman capitals above a bronze door. Before it lay a stone bench, and it was here, Lestrade explained, that the body had been discovered by the groundskeeper at 6:15 that morning. Cedric Holloway had been seated upright, slumped against the side of the mausoleum, his flask open on the ground beside his right hand. His face, by all accounts, peaceful. Holmes said nothing. He dropped to his knees on the damp earth and began to examine the ground with the intensity of a man reading a document written in a language only he could decipher. His long, thin fingers moved across surfaces. His nostrils flared at invisible scents. His eyes narrowed at details that, to my own reasonably trained observation, simply did not exist. He spent several minutes on the base of the mausoleum, the bench, and the surrounding earth. He measured distances with his pocket tape, scraped soil samples into envelopes, and examined the stone bench with his lens, finding a faint residue there which he sniffed carefully and scraped into a separate envelope with particular care. "The body was seated when found?" he asked Lestrade. "Upright, leaning against the stone. Looked like he'd sat down and simply stopped." "And the flask?" "On the ground, by his right hand. Open, half empty or thereabouts. Brandy. You could smell it." "I'm sure one could," said Holmes. He rose and brushed the earth from his knees. "Where is the flask now?" Lestrade produced it from his coat. A handsome thing, silver, monogrammed with the initials CAH, with a screw cap and a leather carrying case. He handed it to Holmes with the manner of a man humouring a child's request for a particular toy. Holmes took the flask and held it to the light, turning it slowly. Then he unscrewed the cap and raised the flask to his nose. I was watching his face. The change was unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional stillness like the shadow of a cloud crossing a field. He lowered the flask, replaced the cap, and slipped it into his own coat pocket without a word. "I say, Holmes," Lestrade began, "I shall require this for examination, Inspector. You will have it returned." Lestrade opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed it again. He had learned, through long and occasionally bitter experience, that arguing with Holmes over evidence was rather like arguing with the tide. "Now then," said Holmes, his voice carrying a new briskness that I recognised as barely concealed excitement, "I should like to speak with the man who found the body." Abel Marsh, the groundskeeper of Briarwood Cemetery, lived in a small stone cottage near the northern wall. He was a broad, weathered man of perhaps 44, with the permanently reddened complexion of a habitual drinker, and hands that were large, are rough, and conspicuously dirty. He stood in his doorway with arms folded, and regarded us with the hostile wariness of a dog guarding a bone it suspects someone means to take. "I already told the inspector everything," he said. "Found him at 6:15. Gates were still locked. He must have come through the side passage. He knew where the loose railing was. I didn't touch nothing. I went for the police." "And you knew Mr. Holloway's habits," said Holmes. Marsh's eyes shifted. "Everyone knew. He came most nights, 2, 3 in the morning, sat by his wife's grave, drank his brandy. I told him it wasn't safe at his age. He didn't listen." Holmes was studying Marsh with that penetrating stillness that so often unsettled those subjected to it. I followed his gaze, the soil packed beneath Marsh's fingernails. Dark, clay-rich earth found only at depth, fresh scratches across both hands, and the faint smell of gin, poorly masked by cheap pipe smoke. "You have been digging recently, Mr. Marsh," said Holmes. "Not the shallow work of gardening. The soil beneath your nails is subsoil and 2 feet down at minimum, and the scratches suggest work done in haste in a confined space." Marsh's face darkened. "I dig graves, Mr. Holmes. It's my profession." "Indeed. And how many graves have you dug this week?" "I don't keep count for consulting detectives." He gripped the door. "I found the body. I reported it. If you've got more questions, Put them to my employer. Oh, wait, he's dead. The door closed with force enough to rattle the frame. A charming fellow, I remarked as we walked back through the cemetery. A frightened one, said Holmes, and a man who digs at night is a man with something to bury, or to unbury, but that is a thread for another hour. Come, Watson, we have a housekeeper to interview. Cedric Holloway's home was a respectable but fading Victorian townhouse in Highgate. The interior was dark, heavy wood panelling, ticking clocks, and the mingled smells of beeswax and old paper. It was the house of a man who had lived surrounded by the past. Mrs. Viola Trent, Cedric's housekeeper of 22 years, received us in the parlour. She was a woman of 63, small and round-shouldered, with red-rimmed eyes and the bustling manner of one who cannot bear to sit still. She had tea laid before we had removed our coats. He was a good man, Mr. Holmes. He the best man I ever knew. He didn't deserve to die alone in that cold place. You knew his routines well, Mrs. Trent? Better than anyone. Supper at 7, reading until 10, a small glass of brandy in the parlour, always from that flask, the silver one. He'd fill it from the bottle on the sideboard. She gestured toward where a cut-glass decanter and a slender, dark bottle stood side by side. Then to bed, and most nights he'd rise at 2 or 3 and walk to the cemetery. It was his way of being close to her. Holmes had moved to the sideboard while she spoke. He lifted the dark bottle, examined the label with great care, and held it to the light. Then he uncorked it and inhaled a long, slow breath through the nose, his eyes half closed. He replaced the cork and turned to me. His voice, when he spoke, was very quiet, pitched for my ears alone. The flask contains cognac, Watson. This bottle contains Armagnac, an 1867 Domaine d'Ognoas, if I am not mistaken. A rare and expensive spirit, entirely distinct in character. He paused. Do you see? I confess I did not see, or rather, I saw the fact but not its significance. Someone changed the brandy in the flask. Someone emptied the Armagnac and replaced it with an inferior spirit. The question is when, and the question after that is why. A man does not swap his own brandy for something cheaper. But someone who wished to introduce a substance into the flask, someone who did not have access to the same rare Armagnac, might bring their own brandy as a vehicle and hope the substitution went unnoticed. He looked at Mrs. Trent, who was pouring tea and had heard nothing. Mrs. Trent, he said, returning to his chair. Who visited Mr. Holloway on the evening before his death, she thought. His nephew, Dr. Julian Holloway. He arrived at 8:30, I should think. I showed him in, and then went out for the evening, the Lamb and Flag, my regular. Mr. Holloway didn't need me once supper things were cleared. And Dr. Holloway was still here when you left? He was, in the parlour with his uncle. What time did you return? Just after 11. The house was dark. Everything was as it always was. Her voice caught. Except it wasn't, was it? Holmes said nothing to that. There was nothing to say. He rose, thanked Mrs. Trent for the tea, and we departed into the fading afternoon. In the cab, back to Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence for a long while, the flask resting on his knee. Then, with a careful, deliberate motion, he unscrewed the cap, dipped the tip of his little finger into the liquid within, and touched it to his tongue. He held it there for a moment, and his expression, already sharp, grew sharper still. He wiped his finger on his handkerchief and turned to me. Watson, this man was not felled by his heart. He was murdered, and with considerable expertise. There is a bitter alkaloid residue in this brandy that should not be there, faint but unmistakable to a trained palate. His grey eyes were alight, burning with that cold, fierce intelligence that I had seen ignite so many times at the threshold of a case. We are hunting someone who knows their poisons, Watson. Someone with the knowledge to select, the skill to prepare, and the intimacy to deliver. This was not a stranger's crime. This was a murder committed by someone Cedric Holloway trusted enough to leave alone with his brandy flask. The cab rattled on through the gathering dark, and Holmes fell silent, but I could see his mind working behind those keen eyes, assembling, discarding, connecting, and I knew that the game was now very much afoot. Hashtag Chapter 3. The Suspects Gather. It was past midnight when Holmes set down his pipette, removed the smoked glass from over the spirit lamp, and turned to me with an expression that held no satisfaction, only the cold clarity of a confirmed suspicion. "A conny teen," he said. The word brought me fully awake. "You are certain?" The marsh reagent confirms it. Aconitine, the chief alkaloid of Aconitum napellus, commonly known as monkshood or wolfsbane, one of the deadliest plant-derived poisons known to science. He held up the test tube. The concentration in that flask was more than sufficient. 3 or 4 swallows would deliver a fatal dose within 90 minutes. The symptoms would present as cardiac arrhythmia, progressing to heart failure. To a police surgeon on a cold October morning, it would look precisely like what it was meant to look like, an old man whose heart gave out. I sat still, processing the implications. My first thought was of my own professional failure. I had accepted the verdict of heart failure without question. The cyanosis around the lips, I said. The constricted pupils. I thought them consistent with cardiac arrest, but aconitine would produce precisely those signs. And it was chosen by someone who knew that, someone with medical or botanical training sufficient to extract the alkaloid, calculate the dosage, and predict the symptoms. This was not the work of an amateur, Watson. This was a physician's murder. We did not sleep that night. By morning, the fog had thinned but not lifted, and Baker Street lay under a grey pall that suited the day's business admirably. Eleanor Holloway arrived at 9:30, and she was not alone. The man who accompanied her was tall, fair-haired, and perhaps 32, with the easy bearing of someone accustomed to being liked. He had a broad, open face, clear blue eyes, and when he spoke it was with the measured confidence of a man who spent his days putting anxious patients at ease. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor." "Watson." "This is my cousin Julian," said Eleanor. "Dr. Julian Holloway. He was the closest thing father had to a son." "Gentlemen," said Julian, taking the offered chair. "Eleanor has told me she has engaged your services, and I am glad of it. If there is anything I can do to assist, you have only to ask. My uncle was a good man, and if someone has harmed him, I want to know." His grief appeared genuine, visible in the shadows beneath his eyes, the occasional faltering of composure before he gathered it again. The physician in me warmed to him at once. Here was a man bearing loss with dignity. Holmes did not warm. He watched Julian with the same attentive stillness he had turned upon Abel Marsh, and I sensed the same silent cataloguing at work. "You are a physician, Dr. Holloway," said Holmes. "What is your speciality?" "Herbal and botanical medicine," said Julian. "I maintain a practice in Hampstead. I believe there is a great deal of untapped potential in natural remedies, properly applied. My uncle was sceptical, naturally. He was a solicitor, a man of documents and precedents, but he supported my work generously." "And you saw him recently?" "The evening before his death. I visited at home, we discussed family matters, the fund. He seemed well enough. Tired, perhaps. I left at approximately 9 o'clock. Julian paused. If I had known it was the last time, I would have stayed longer. It was a natural thing to say, and he said it naturally. But I noted, as clinical observation rather than suspicion, that Julian's fingers bore a curious yellowish discoloration, most pronounced on the thumb and forefinger of the right hand. I attributed it to his herbal work. A man who handles plant tinctures daily will often show such staining. It seemed unremarkable. It would prove to be anything but. "Dr. Holloway," said Holmes, "you have medical training. If I were to tell you that your uncle's brandy flask contained traces of an alkaloid poison, Specifically, aconitine. What would be your professional assessment? Julian's reaction was immediate, and to my eye, entirely authentic. The colour left his face. He set down his teacup with exaggerated care, as though afraid his hand might betray him. Aconitine, he repeated. Good God. That would produce precisely the symptoms of heart failure. Cardiac arrhythmia, bradycardia, a respiratory depression. It is one of the most lethal plant-derived toxins known. The source would be monkshood, Aconitum napellus. He looked at Holmes with what appeared to be dawning horror. You're saying my uncle was poisoned? I am saying the evidence strongly suggests it. Julian was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, Who would do such a thing? That, said Holmes, is what I intend to discover. Eleanor, who had been sitting rigid throughout this exchange, let out a sound that was half gasp and half vindication. I told you, she said to no one in particular. I told them all. We left Julian and Eleanor at Baker Street and proceeded to St Dunstan's Church in Highgate, which overlooked Briarwood Cemetery from a rise to the east. The interior held the particular cold of stone buildings never truly warm. Candle wax and damp hymnals, echoing footsteps, stained glass casting fractured light across the nave. The Reverend Thomas Blackwood received us in the vestry, a lean, composed man of 51 with silver-streaked hair and careful diction. He spoke of Cedric with what seemed like genuine fondness, though the fondness never quite reached warmth. A pillar of the parish, said Blackwood. His dedication to the Restoration Fund was exemplary. He will be sorely missed. And yet, said Holmes, I understand there was a disagreement between you, a rather public one, in fact. Shouting was involved. Blackwood's composure flickered, the briefest tightening around the mouth, before it settled again. A disagreement about parish finances, I will not deny it. Cedric was meticulous in his accounting, and he raised certain questions about the church collections that I felt were unwarranted. We exchanged words. It was resolved. Was it? To my satisfaction, yes. And to Mr. Holloway's? Blackwood did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was level but careful. Cedric was a persistent man. He had concerns, and he intended to pursue them. I respected his diligence, even when I found it uncomfortable. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the vestry window, which overlooked the churchyard. The cemetery wall ran along the far boundary, and between the church and the wall stretched a garden of modest ambition, herbs, a few rose bushes, and a border of tall plants that grew wild against the old stone. Tell me. Reverend, said Holmes, gesturing toward the border, do you know what those tall plants are? The ones with the purple hooded flowers growing along the cemetery wall. Blackwood joined him at the window and squinted. I believe those are larkspur, he said. They've been growing there for years. Rather pretty in summer. Holmes said nothing, but I saw the faintest ghost of something pass across his face. Not satisfaction exactly, but the quiet confirmation of a theory tested and validated. The plants along the cemetery wall were not larkspur. Even from this distance I could recognize the distinctive hooded shape of their flowers. They were monkshood, Aconitum napellus, the very plant from which aconitine is derived, and the vicar of St Dunstan's could not identify them. We departed the church and walked in silence down the path toward the main road. The fog had begun to thin at last, and a weak, wintry sun was attempting, without much conviction, to assert itself. Holmes walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his chin lowered, his eyes fixed on the middle distance in that characteristic posture of deep internal deliberation. What do you make of him? I asked. Blackwood, a man with a secret certainly. The parish finances he mentioned are not the cemetery fund. They are the church collections, which is a separate matter entirely. He is skimming, Watson. The question is whether his theft extends to murder. He had motive, I said. If Cedric was pressing him about the accounts, He had motive, opportunity, and proximity to a source of monkshood, Holmes agreed, and yet he cannot identify the plant by sight. A man who intended to extract aconitine from those churchyard flowers would, at minimum, need to know what they were. He could be dissembling. He could. But the error was too specific to be invented on the spot. He said larkspur, a reasonable mistake for a man with no botanical knowledge. As the flowers bear a superficial resemblance, a man feigning ignorance would more likely claim total unfamiliarity than offer an incorrect identification. I considered this. It was the kind of distinction that Holmes drew effortlessly, and that I, for all my years at his side, still found myself marvelling at. The difference between a lie and a genuine mistake. Read in the specificity of a single wrong word. We had reached the road. Holmes stopped and turned to face me, and there was something in his expression that I had seen at the outset of many cases, a fierce, restless energy, constrained by the discipline of method. "We have a poisoning confirmed," he said. "We have a victim with enemies and secrets. We have a groundskeeper who digs in the night and cannot meet a man's eyes. We have a housekeeper with unrestricted access to the murder weapon. We have a vicar who was quarrelling with the dead man over money. And we have a charming young physician who specializes in the very branch of medicine that could produce the poison that killed his uncle, and whose grief, though I do not doubt its sincerity, carries a weight that goes beyond shock. It has the heaviness of something older, Watson, something that existed before the death." He paused, letting the silence gather. "I must now inform Lestrade that this is a murder investigation," he continued. "The natural death narrative ends today, and when it does, every person connected to Cedric Holloway will feel the ground shift beneath their feet. We shall watch carefully to see who stumbles." He turned and walked toward the waiting cab. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. "Everyone in this case is hiding something, Watson. The trick is determining which secret is worth killing for." Hashtag Chapter 4, The Poisoner's Garden. The formal announcement of murder transformed the case. Lestrade received Holmes's chemical report with the expression of a man told his roof is leaking. He dispatched constables to re-examine the scene, ordered the body held, and, with visible reluctance, asked Holmes to continue his inquiries. By the following afternoon, Holmes had arranged what he described as a social call of a purely investigative nature, and we found ourselves in a hansom rattling through the quiet streets of Hampstead toward the home of Dr. Julian Holloway. Julian's house was a handsome modern villa in Hampstead, the practice occupying the ground floor. The consulting room was bright, well-appointed, and smelled of lavender, designed to put nervous patients at ease. "Gentlemen, welcome," said Julian. "Let me show you the practice. Anything that helps the investigation I am happy to provide." He led us through the consulting room, the dispensary, shelves of labelled tinctures and dried herbs in neat rows, and through a rear door into his conservatory. The conservatory was a revelation, a large glass structure flooded with pale autumn light, within which grew a profusion of plants that would not have been out of place in a botanical garden. Foxglove and belladonna, comfrey and valerian, chamomile and feverfew, and dozens more I could not identify. The air was warm, damp, heavy with the green scent of living things. I described it all with enthusiasm in my journal. I did not know I was cataloguing the source of a murder weapon. Holmes moved through the conservatory with the unhurried manner of a man admiring a garden, but I knew his eyes were doing something altogether different from admiring. He paused at various specimens, asked intelligent questions about their medicinal applications, and listened to Julian's answers with every appearance of genuine interest. Julian was an excellent guide, knowledgeable, articulate, clearly passionate about his work. They stopped together before a tall cluster of plants at the far end of the conservatory. The stems were upright, the leaves deeply divided, and the flowers, though past their best in October, were unmistakable. Hooded, the deep violet blue of a bruise, arranged in elegant racemes. "Aconitum napellus," Holmes murmured, bending to examine them. "Monkshood, a beautiful and exceedingly dangerous plant. A doctor." Julian nodded without hesitation. "It has legitimate medicinal uses in microdoses, for neuralgia and certain cardiac conditions when properly prepared. The therapeutic window is narrow, of course. The line between remedy and poison is a matter of milligrams." He smiled. "That is true of a great many things in my conservatory, Mr. Holmes. Foxglove will steady a heart or stop it, depending on the dose. Belladonna dilates the pupils for ophthalmic examination or induces fatal delirium. The art lies in precision." "And you grow these openly," said Holmes. "I do. There is nothing secret about it. Every physician who works with botanical medicine must understand the plants at their most potent. I would no more hide monkshood from my conservatory than a surgeon would hide his scalpels from his operating theatre." It was a reasonable answer, delivered with complete composure. Holmes studied the plants for a moment longer, then moved on. But I noticed, and set it down in my mind, though I could not yet have said why, that his fingers had brushed the soil at the base of the monk's hood, and that he had examined his fingertips briefly before wiping them on his handkerchief. We took our leave shortly afterward, Julian walking us to the door with the warmth of a good host and the openness of a man with nothing to hide. In the cab, Holmes was silent for several minutes, staring out at the Hampstead streets with his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Well?" I asked. "A remarkable collection," he said, "and a remarkably composed young man." "You suspect him?" "I suspect everyone, Watson. It is the only safe policy at this stage of an investigation. But I will tell you this. There were at least 8 plants in that conservatory from which a fatal preparation could be derived, and Julian Holloway knows the precise lethal dosage of every one of them. That is not suspicion, it is observation." He said nothing more until we reached Baker Street. That evening, while I sat reading by the fire, Holmes retired to his chemistry table with the brandy flask and his magnifying lens. I heard him working, the soft clink of glass, the scratch of a steel instrument, and left him to it. When Holmes was engaged in the close examination of physical evidence, interruption was neither welcome nor productive. It was past 10 when he called me over. "Come and look at this, Watson." He had removed the screw-cap stopper from the flask and placed it under his strongest lens, directing a concentrated beam of lamplight upon the interior threading. I bent to look and saw, at first, nothing remarkable. Merely the spiral grooves of the brass threading, slightly tarnished. "Look at the second groove from the top," said Holmes. "The interior surface." I looked again, more carefully, and there it was. A faint, partial impression, the whorl and ridge of a human fingerprint, preserved in a thin film of oil or grease upon the brass. "Someone unscrewed this stopper," said Holmes, "and did not think to clean the inside of the threading. The exterior of the flask has been wiped quite thoroughly. The cap, the body, the monogram. But the interior of the stopper, where the fingers must grip and turn, that was overlooked." He straightened. "This is the mark of a careful mind that was not quite careful enough. And it is evidence, Watson, physical, irrefutable evidence that someone other than Cedric Holloway opened this flask." "Can you identify the print?" "Not yet, but I have preserved it, and when the time comes it will be matched." There was something in his voice, a quiet, implacable certainty, that told me he already had a suspicion about whose hand had left that mark. The following morning, Holmes went out alone. He told me only that he was returning to Cedric's house to examine the study more thoroughly, and that I might profitably spend the morning interviewing the neighbours on Cedric Street. I was, by now, accustomed to these divisions of labour. Holmes pursued the threads that required his particular faculties, and I pursued those that required persistence and a trustworthy manner. Qualities he credited me with generously, if sometimes with a faint air of consolation. And I spoke with 4 of Cedric's neighbours that morning. 3 confirmed that Dr. Julian Holloway had visited on the evening of October the 14th, arriving at approximately 8:30. Mrs. Caldwell, directly opposite, had noted the time because her parlour clock struck the half-hour as the doctor-nephew walked up the path. Mr. Pemberton at number 14 had seen Julian departing some time after 9. When I relayed this to Julian later that afternoon, meeting him by chance near the cemetery gates, he confirmed it without discomfort. Yes, I was there. A pleasant family visit. Uncle seemed tired, but in good spirits. His face betrayed nothing. He was either innocent or extraordinarily controlled. Holmes, meanwhile, had found rather more. He returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon with a bundle of papers under his arm and an energy about him that I had learned to associate with significant discovery. He shed his coat, filled his pipe, and spread the papers across the dining table without a word of explanation. "Cedric's study," he said at last, tapping the nearest sheet. "The man was meticulous, Watson. He kept records of everything, every penny, every transaction, every meeting. And he was worried." He showed me first the desk diary, a leather-bound volume in which Cedric had recorded his appointments and thoughts in a small, precise hand. Holmes had it open to the entry for October the 14th, the day before the death. I read the words and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. J coming tonight. God help us both. "J," I said. "Julian." "Almost certainly. And this is not the entry of a man expecting a pleasant family chat." Holmes turned to the papers. "Now look at these." They were accounts, the ledgers of the Briarwood Cemetery Restoration Fund, which Cedric had administered as chief trustee. Holmes had arranged them chronologically, and even to my untrained eye the pattern was visible. A series of withdrawals spread across the past 2 years, each modest enough to avoid immediate detection but collectively amounting to a staggering sum. Cedric had circled each one in red ink, annotated them with dates and questions, and drawn connecting lines between entries as though tracing the path of a disease through a body. £2,400, said Holmes, withdrawn from the fund over 23 months. The entries are disguised as payments to contractors, suppliers and maintenance firms, but Cedric verified every name. Half of them do not exist. The rest were paid far less than the ledger records. So someone has been systematically embezzling from the Restoration Fund, and Cedric Holloway discovered it. Blackwood, I said at once. He was already skimming from the church collections. The church collections are a separate matter entirely, said Holmes. Blackwood's embezzlement is petty, small sums diverted to pay his brother's asylum fees. The fund is administered not by the church, but by a board of trustees. Cedric was the chair. The other trustees include 3 local businessmen and 1 physician who volunteered his services 2 years ago. He looked at me steadily. Dr. Julian Holloway. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Holmes gathered the papers and arranged them in a neat stack. Then he lit his pipe, settled into his chair, and spoke through the first curl of smoke with the deliberate calm of a man who has seen the shape of something in the fog and is waiting for it to resolve. There is a poison in Briarwood that has nothing to do with wolfsbane, Watson. Follow the money. Chapter 5. The False Trail. I have set down in these pages, with what I trust is reasonable honesty, the occasions upon which my reasoning proved sound and my contributions to Holmes's investigations bore fruit. Fairness demands that I record with equal candour those occasions upon which I was entirely, comprehensively, and, as Holmes would later observe with more amusement than I thought the situation warranted, magnificently wrong. The Briarwood Cemetery case was such an occasion. It began on the morning of October the 18th, 3 days into the investigation, when I presented to Holmes a theory I had been assembling with what I believed was considerable rigour. I had risen early, reviewed my notes, and arranged the evidence in what seemed to me an unassailable sequence. I stood before the fireplace at Baker Street with the air, I confess, of a man about to deliver a verdict. "Consider the Reverend Blackwood," I said. "He had a public and acrimonious quarrel with Cedric Holloway over financial irregularities, a quarrel witnessed by at least 3 parishioners. He has been embezzling from the church collections to pay for his brother's care at Colney Hatch Asylum, giving him both a pattern of financial desperation and a specific, urgent need for money. He has unrestricted access to Briarwood Cemetery at all hours, and monkshood grows wild along the churchyard wall not 30 yards from his vestry. He is a man of composure, planning, and discipline, qualities required by this crime. And Cedric was pressing him, Holmes, pressing him hard. The man was about to be exposed." I paused for effect. Holmes was reclining in his chair with his eyes half closed and his fingertips pressed together, like an attitude that might have indicated either profound attention or profound indifference. Experience had taught me it was usually the former disguised as the latter. "Interesting, Watson," he said. "Most interesting. You disagree?" "I neither agree nor disagree. I observe that you have constructed a plausible case based upon the available evidence, and that every element of your theory is logically consistent with the facts as you understand them." He opened one eye. "The question, of course, is whether the facts as you understand them are the facts as they are." This was not the resounding endorsement I had hoped for, but neither was it a dismissal, and I took what comfort I could from the distinction. Holmes, for his part, had spent the previous evening with the Restoration Fund ledgers, spread across the dining table, working through them line by line with the patience of a man dismantling a clock to understand its mechanism. I had watched him for a time, the scratch of his pen, the occasional sharp intake of breath when a figure caught his attention, before retiring. By morning he had covered several pages of his own notebook with calculations. "The fund discrepancies are more extensive than Cedric's annotations suggest," he told me over breakfast. "The total missing sum is £2,412, withdrawn over 23 months through payments to fictitious contractors and inflated invoices. The embezzlement is systematic, deliberate, and has been conducted by someone with direct access to the fund's accounts." "Blackwood," I said. Holmes looked at me for a moment, then returned to his toast. "The fund and the parish accounts are administered separately, Watson. Blackwood's name does not appear on any fund document I have examined. But you are correct that the pattern of embezzlement, small sums spread over time disguised as legitimate expenses, is consistent with the method used in the parish accounts." He paused. "Whether the same hand is responsible for both is a question that remains open." I took this as tacit support for my theory. It was not, but I would not understand that until later. Our business that morning took us back to Briarwood Cemetery, where Holmes had arranged to meet Abel Marsh. The groundskeeper received us at his cottage with marginally less hostility than before, though his manner remained that of a man standing in a room he knows to contain a trap. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Marsh," he said, settling uninvited into the single chair that Marsh's cramped parlour afforded, "I have been examining the burial records for Briarwood Cemetery. They are maintained with admirable precision. Plot numbers, dates of interment, names of the deceased, and names of the bereaved families, all very thorough." Marsh said nothing. His jaw worked silently as though he were chewing something bitter. "I have also walked the cemetery myself," Holmes continued, "and compared certain plots against the records. I find discrepancies. Plot 47, for example, is recorded as the resting place of Mrs. Agnes Whitfield, interred in August of this year. And yet the earth over plot 47 shows evidence of having been disturbed at least twice since the interment, once within the past fortnight. The same is true of plots 61, 73, and 89. Marsh's face had gone the colour of old tallow. "Furthermore," said Holmes, "I have made inquiries at the medical schools. St. Bartholomew's anatomy department has, in the past 18 months, received 4 cadavers from an unnamed source in the Highgate area. Delivered by night at a price of £12 per specimen. The delivery agent was described as a large man with dirty hands who smelled of gin. Holmes regarded Marsh steadily. "Shall I continue, or would you prefer to save us both the time?" Marsh broke. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was the slow, grinding surrender of a man who has been carrying a weight too long and has finally set it down. He sank onto the edge of his cot and put his face in his hands. "It's not what you think," he said. "I never hurt no one. They're already dead when It's just business. The medical schools need bodies for the students. The families don't know. No one's harmed by it." "Except the dead," said Holmes dryly, "and the families who believe their loved ones rest undisturbed. But that is a matter for the law and your conscience, Mr. Marsh. What concerns me is this. Did you kill Cedric Holloway?" "No." The word came out as though torn from him. "Mr. Holloway he was pushing to have me dismissed, yes. He suspected something. But killing him would have been the worst thing I could do. A new trustee might audit the burial records. Mr. Holloway never did. He was too busy with the fund accounts. He wanted me gone, but he hadn't yet looked at the graves. Killing him would have brought exactly the kind of scrutiny I couldn't survive." Holmes considered this for a long moment, then rose. "I believe you, Mr. Marsh. Your crime requires the obscurity that Cedric Holloway's continued supervision provided. His death is against your interests. You are a ghoul, but you are not a murderer." I disagreed. Marsh's desperation, his access, his knowledge of Cedric's routine all pointed in my view toward guilt, but I held my tongue. Holmes had dismissed suspects before on logical grounds that I found insufficient, and he had invariably been correct. We left Marsh's cottage and walked back through the cemetery as the afternoon light began to fail. The fog, which had lifted briefly around midday, was returning with the approach of evening, rolling in from the north in slow, heavy waves that swallowed the headstones and turned the yew trees into formless, dark shapes. The temperature was dropping. Our breath hung in the air before us. It was Watson's instinct, military instinct perhaps, never fully extinguished, that first sensed something wrong. A prickling at the back of my neck, the feeling of being observed. I stopped. Holmes, a pace ahead, stopped with me. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "We are being watched." Holmes did not turn. His eyes moved, a quick lateral sweep, and then he said very softly, "The Caruthers Monument, 20 yards to our left. Someone is standing behind it." I saw the figure then, or rather, I saw the suggestion of a figure, a dark shape, emotionless, partially concealed by the bulk of a granite obelisk. It was impossible to determine age, sex, or build through the fog, but the posture was unmistakable. Someone was standing very still and watching us with deliberate intent. My hand went to my revolver. "Steady, Watson," said Holmes. I took a step toward the monument. The figure moved, a sudden fluid withdrawal, like a shadow retreating from a light, and was gone, absorbed into the fog between the graves. I heard footsteps, rapid and light, receding toward the eastern wall, and then nothing. The cemetery was silent again, save for the distant tolling of St. Dunstan's bell marking the quarter hour. "Should we pursue?" I asked, my heart hammering. "In this fog, through a graveyard, against someone who knows the terrain better than we do?" "No." Holmes stood very still, listening. "But the incident is instructive. We are being followed, Watson. Someone is watching our progress through this case with a very personal interest. The killer? Possibly, or possibly someone else with reason to fear what we might uncover. This cemetery holds more secrets than one murder, and not everyone who watches us means us harm." He turned toward the gate. "Come, we have learned enough for one day." We walked back to the road in silence, but I confess the fog no longer seemed merely atmospheric. It felt hostile, a living thing that concealed watchers and obscured threats, pressing against us from all sides. That evening I sat at my desk and composed my notes with a certainty that, in hindsight, amounts to a kind of blindness. I wrote of the evidence, the suspects, the tangled web of secrets that Briarwood Cemetery concealed, and I wrote with the conviction of a man who has weighed the facts and found them conclusive. The sentence that would prove to be my most spectacular error. I am increasingly certain that the Reverend Blackwood holds the key to this dark affair. I set down my pen with satisfaction, closed my journal, and went to bed believing I had seen clearly. I had not seen at all. Chapter 6. The Collapse. The destruction of a theory one has built with care is an uncomfortable experience. When the destruction is swift, public, canned and delivered by one's closest friend with an air of gentle inevitability, it is rather worse. It began with a telegram. Holmes read it at the breakfast table and said, "Your vicar has an alibi, Watson." "I beg your pardon?" "The Crowe family of Muswell Hill have confirmed, 3 of them independently, that Blackwood was at the bedside of Mrs. Agnes Crowe from 11 o'clock on the night of October the 14th until 5:30 the following morning, administering last rites. Mrs. Our Crowe died at 4:17. Blackwood was present throughout. He could not have been at Briarwood Cemetery. I set down my knife. The theory I had assembled with such confidence lay around me like the pieces of a broken vase. 3 witnesses, I said. 4, including the family physician. The alibi is unassailable. Holmes regarded me without unkindness. "Your reasoning was sound, Watson. The evidence pointed clearly to Blackwood. The difficulty is that it pointed there by coincidence rather than causation. And the monk's hood in the churchyard? I tested this yesterday." Holmes retrieved a botanical plate from his desk, a colour illustration of Aconitum napellus from Lindley's British Flora. "I showed this to Blackwood. He studied it and identified it, with confidence, as larkspur. The same error as before. A man feigning ignorance of a plant he used to commit murder would claim not to recognise it at all. Blackwood consistently misidentifies monkshood because he genuinely does not know the difference." I sat in silence, absorbing the collapse. "Then who?" I asked. Holmes did not answer directly. Instead he said, "I think it is time we had a frank conversation with Miss Holloway." Eleanor arrived at Baker Street within the hour, summoned by a tersely worded note. As she entered our sitting room with the wary expression of someone who suspects they are about to be confronted with a truth they have been working very hard to conceal. Holmes did not make her wait. "Miss Holloway," he said, "on the night of your father's death you were not at your flat in Islington. You were at the chambers of Mr. Arthur Pemberton, a barrister of Lincoln's Inn, where you remained from approximately 10 o'clock in the evening until 5 o'clock the following morning. His housekeeper, Mrs. Briggs, can confirm your departure at dawn. You have been conducting a secret affair with Mr. Pemberton, who is married, and it is this, not grief alone, that has made you evasive and unreliable throughout this investigation." Eleanor did not speak. She stood very still, her face white, her hands clenched at her sides. "Furthermore," Holmes continued, "you were the figure who followed us through Briarwood Cemetery 2 evenings ago. You had gone there to meet Mr. Pemberton near the eastern gate, your customary meeting place, and remained to observe our movements. You have been shadowing this investigation because you feared your secret would be exposed." The silence was absolute. Then Eleanor sat down on the edge of the settee, as though her legs had refused to support her. "Yes," she said quietly. "All of it. Yes. You understand that this alibi clears you entirely of any involvement in your father's death?" "I understand. And I understand that it destroys Arthur's marriage and my reputation in the process." She looked at Holmes with eyes that held no anger, only a dull, exhausted resignation. "I hired you to find my father's killer, Mr. Holmes. I did not expect to be unmasked myself." I have no interest in your private affairs, Miss Holloway, except insofar as they bear upon the murder. Your alibi will be confirmed with Mrs. Briggs and recorded in Lestrade's file. I shall ensure that the specific nature of your whereabouts is communicated to the inspector privately and does not become a matter of public record. Something shifted in her expression, a loosening, as though a knot that had been tightened for days had finally begun to ease. "Thank you," she said, and I believed she meant it. After Eleanor's departure, Holmes stood at the window for a time, looking down at Baker Street with his hands clasped behind his back. Oh, the morning was grey and still, the kind of London day that seems to hold its breath. "2 suspects cleared," I said, "Blackwood and Eleanor, and you have already dismissed Marsh." "Which leaves us with Mrs. Trent and Dr. Holloway," said Holmes, though I use the word "leaves" loosely. I did not arrive at this point by elimination, Watson. I have been pursuing a specific line of inquiry since the second day of this case. The clearing of Blackwood and Eleanor merely removes the distractions. Before I could press him on this, there came a knock at the door, and Lestrade was shown up. The inspector was not in good humour. He stood in the middle of our sitting room with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has been given a jigsaw puzzle with no edge pieces. "2 of my best suspects cleared in a single morning," he said. "The vicar's alibi is solid as a church wall, and the daughter was, well, she was accounted for." He shot a glance at Holmes. "I don't suppose you've got something for me, Mr. Holmes? The Commissioner is asking questions, and I've got nothing but a dead solicitor and a flask full of poison." "Patience, Inspector. The case is not stalling. It is clarifying." "It doesn't feel like clarifying. It feels like everyone's innocent and the poison mixed itself." Holmes smiled faintly. "We have eliminated the obvious, Lestrade. Now we may attend to the truth." Lestrade departed with no visible comfort, and Holmes turned his attention to the final thread of the morning, Mrs. Viola Trent. He did not visit her. Instead, he sent me to Clerkenwell with an address and a name, Mr. Samuel Creech, a pawnbroker on Turnmill Street. I found the establishment without difficulty, a narrow, grimy shop wedged between a chandler and a tobacconist, and Mr. Creech proved both cooperative and voluble when presented with Holmes's card. Yes, he knew a Mrs. Trent, a regular customer, in fact. She had been bringing him items for years, silverware, small decorative pieces, the occasional book. Good quality, always. He showed me his ledger. The transactions were modest but steady, spanning the better part of a decade. I returned to Baker Street with this information and found Holmes already in possession of a further discovery. He had obtained a copy of Cedric Holloway's will, the current version, recently amended, and had been reading it with care. Mrs. Trent's bequest was reduced in the latest revision, he told me, but not because Cedric discovered her thefts. The reduction was proportional. Cedric added a substantial charitable bequest to the Restoration Fund, £300, and reduced all personal bequests accordingly to fund it. Eleanor's inheritance was reduced by the same percentage. Viola's diminished bequest is not evidence of targeted punishment. It is arithmetic. Then her motive evaporates. Such as it was. Viola Trent is a petty thief who loved her employer and fears the loss of her position more than the loss of her liberty. She did not poison Cedric Holloway. She stole his silverware, which is a rather different class of crime. He paused. I shall inform her that I am aware of the thefts and that they are irrelevant to my investigation. She will be humiliated, but she will also be relieved. People generally are when the secret they have been guarding turns out to be smaller than the secret they feared. And so, in the space of a single day, the field had narrowed. Blackwood, cleared by an unassailable alibi and genuine botanical ignorance. Eleanor, cleared by an alibi she had been too ashamed to provide. Marsh, dismissed by the logic that his own criminal enterprise required Cedric alive. Viola, dismissed by motive evaporation and the mathematics of a revised will. 4 suspects examined, 4 secrets exposed, 4 eliminated. The investigation that Lestrade believed to be stalling was, as Holmes had said, clarifying, stripping away the false trails and misdirections until only the truth remained. And the truth, I was beginning to sense, was something Holmes had been circling for days, Ace approaching with the methodical patience of a man who knows where the prey lies and is waiting for the moment to close the trap. I did not yet see it, but I felt it, a gathering tension in Holmes's manner, an energy that grew more concentrated as each false lead fell away. He was not frustrated by the narrowing of suspects. He was energized by it. That evening, at approximately 7:30, Holmes rose abruptly from his chair, set down the fund ledgers he had been reviewing, and reached for his coat and hat. His movements had the decisive quality of a man who has resolved upon a course of action and will not be dissuaded. "I must go away for a time, Watson," he said. "I have a thread to follow, and it leads somewhere I must go alone." "Where?" "That I cannot tell you, not from any desire for secrecy, but because I am not yet certain what I shall find. And I will not burden you with speculation when I can return with facts." He wound his scarf around his throat and took up his stick. "Do not expect me before Thursday." "Thursday? Holmes? That is 2 days. 36 hours to be precise. I shall send word if I am delayed." He paused at the door, and for an instant something passed across his face that I had rarely seen there. Not uncertainty exactly, but a kind of gravity, as though the thread he intended to follow led somewhere he wished it did not. "Holmes," I said, "is it dangerous?" He considered this. "Not physically, but it may be unpleasant." He met my eyes. "Keep your notes in order, Watson. When I return, the picture will be very different." He was gone within the hour. I stood alone in the sitting room, surrounded by the papers and artifacts of an investigation that had shed every suspect I thought plausible and left behind only questions I could not yet answer. I sat down and waited. It was, I reflected, what Watson did best. Chapter 7. The Breakthrough. Holmes had been gone for 18 hours, and Baker Street had never felt so quiet. I occupied myself as best I could. I read, I wrote up my notes, I paced the sitting room with a restlessness that Mrs. Hudson bore with characteristic patience, bringing me tea at intervals and remarking, with the resigned wisdom of long experience, that Mr. Holmes always came back and that fretting never hastened his return. She was right, of course, but the silence pressed upon me in a way I found difficult to bear. In the ordinary course of an investigation, Holmes's presence, even his most maddening silences, provided a kind of gravitational centre around which my own thoughts could orbit. Without it, I found myself adrift among the facts of the case, turning them over endlessly without resolution. I returned to my journal and read through the entries I had made since the investigation began. The crime scene at Briarwood, the flask, Marsh's dirty fingernails, Viola's tears, Blackwood's measured composure, Eleanor's fierce insistence, Julian's charming cooperation. Julian. I paused at the entry I had written after our visit to Baker Street, the one in which I described the young physician's arrival with Eleanor, his warmth, his grief, his evident desire to help. And there, near the bottom of the page, a line I had written with no particular emphasis. His fingers bore a curious yellowish discoloration, most pronounced on the thumb and forefinger of the right hand. I attributed it to his herbal work. Asterisk. I stared at the sentence. Something stirred at the back of my mind, a connection trying to form, a shape glimpsed through fog. Yellowed fingers, herbal work, chemical staining, the conservatory full of poisonous plants, the monk's hood, the aconitine. The thought was there, at the very edge of articulation, and then it slipped away. I could not hold it. I told myself I was making connections where none existed, seeing patterns born of anxiety rather than evidence. I set down the journal and went to bed. I did not sleep well. The following day, Thursday, passed with agonizing slowness. No telegram, no message, no sign of Holmes. I visited the cemetery in the afternoon, more for the occupation than any investigative purpose, and stood for a time at the Holloway mausoleum, looking at the white marble and the name carved above the bronze door. The fog was lighter today, and a pale sun filtered through the yew trees, casting long shadows across the graves. It was a melancholy place even in daylight, the silence of it, the patient stillness of the stones. I was back at Baker Street by 4 o'clock, and I had barely removed my coat when I heard the front door open and the unmistakable sound of Holmes's tread upon the stair, quick, light, energized. He burst into the sitting room like a man returning from a hunt, and the change in him was immediate and electric. He was tired, that much was evident in the shadows beneath his eyes and the drawn quality of his face. But beneath the exhaustion there burned a fierce, concentrated vitality that I had learned to associate with only one thing. He had found what he was looking for. "Watson," he said, shedding his coat and crossing directly to the fireplace. "I know who killed Cedric Holloway." I rose from my chair. "Who?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he filled his pipe with deliberate care. I lit it and drew several long contemplative breaths before speaking. "The answer was in the brandy, Watson. It was always in the brandy, and it was in front of us from the very first hour." He settled into his chair with the air of a man arranging his thoughts for delivery. "Sit down. I have a great deal to tell you." He began with the finances. "The Restoration Fund embezzlement was not Blackwood's work," he said. "I have spent the past 36 hours tracing the withdrawals to their source. The fictitious contractors, the inflated invoices, they were authorized by a single trustee who had signing authority over the fund's accounts. That trustee is Dr. Julian Holloway." I opened my mouth. Holmes raised a hand. "The bank records are unambiguous. Julian added himself to the fund's board 2 years ago at Cedric's invitation, a gesture of trust toward a beloved nephew. Within 3 months, the withdrawals began. Small sums at first, £12 here, 20 there, always disguised as payments to suppliers or maintenance firms. But the pattern accelerated. By the end of the second year, the total had reached £2,400. "But why? Julian's practice seems prosperous." "His practice is modest and his debts are catastrophic." Holmes's voice was flat, precise. "I spent Tuesday evening in 2 gambling establishments in Soho, the kind that do not advertise and do not keep their doors locked for the respectable. I went in disguise, naturally. A merchant seaman with money to lose is welcome in such places, and no one examines his credentials too closely. Julian Holloway is known in both establishments. He has been a regular for 3 years. His debts, accumulated at Faro and Rouge et Noir, are substantial, and his creditors are not patient men." Good God. He stole from the fund to cover his gambling losses. He stole from the man who raised him, who paid for his education, who treated him as a son, and Cedric discovered it. Holmes paused. The diary entry. "J. Coming tonight. God help us both." Cedric confronted Julian on the evening of October the 14th. He showed him the accounts. He gave him 48 hours to confess voluntarily or face exposure. Julian's response was not confession. It was murder. The room was very still. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the October evening was settling over Baker Street, and the lamplighter was making his rounds, his pole leaving small points of gold in the gathering dark. "There is more," said Holmes. "I deployed the Baker Street irregulars yesterday morning, with instructions to search the garden of Julian's Hampstead property, specifically the compost heap at the rear of the conservatory. Wiggins, who is worth his weight in irregular gold, found what I expected him to find. He reached into his coat and produced a small envelope, from which he shook onto the table several fragments of dark glass. They were small, sharp-edged, and when I bent to examine them, I caught the faintest trace of a chemical odour. Bitter, organic, unmistakable to a physician's nose. "The preparation vial," I said. "Precisely. Julian prepared the aconitine tincture, blended it with cognac, carried it to his uncle's house in this vial, and poured it into the flask while Cedric was in his study retrieving the fund papers. Afterward, he took the vial home, smashed it, and buried the fragments in his garden compost. A thorough disposal, but not thorough enough. Glass survives, and the chemical residue on these fragments is consistent with aconitine." He gathered the fragments carefully and returned them to the envelope, and then he sat back and regarded me with an expression I could not quite read. Triumph, certainly, but underlaid with something else, something that looked to my eye remarkably like sadness. "Julian loved his Uncle Watson," he said quietly. "I do not doubt that. The grief we observed at Baker Street was genuine, not performed but felt. He wept for the man he killed, and that is what makes this case wretched rather than merely criminal. He was not driven by hatred or cruelty. He was driven by the terror of a man who saw his entire life, his wife, his unborn child, his practice, his name, about to be swept away by the consequences of his own weakness. He chose murder over confession, and he chose it because confession required a courage he did not possess." There was a silence. I did not know what to say. The case had resolved itself not into the satisfying clarity of a puzzle solved, but into something more complex and more painful. The image of a man destroying what he loved because he could not bear to lose what he had built. "What do we do now?" I asked. Holmes's expression changed. The sadness receded, replaced by the sharp, purposeful focus of a man who has moved from understanding to action. "We set a trap," he said. "I have arranged a dinner at Cedric Holloway's house for tomorrow evening, ostensibly to gather the family and associates for a discussion of the fund's future and a reading of certain provisions of the will. Eleanor has agreed. Lestrade will attend. All interested parties will be present." His eyes glittered. "Including Dr. Julian Holloway." "You intend to confront him there?" "I intend to confirm the final piece of evidence there. The fingerprint on the flask stopper must be matched. I need Julian to handle a glass in lamplight, crystal preferably, so that I may compare the prints and observe his hands under direct illumination. The chemical staining from aconitine preparation does not wash away easily, Watson. Under the right light, it will be visible." He paused. When a poisoner believes he has escaped, he grows careless, and carelessness, under the right light, is visible. He rose and crossed to the desk, where he composed a telegram with swift, decisive strokes. "To Dr. Julian Holloway," he said, reading it back. "Requesting his attendance at a dinner at the Holloway residence tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock, to discuss the future of the Restoration Fund and related matters. Signed, Sherlock Holmes, on behalf of Miss Eleanor Holloway." He sealed it and rang for Mrs. Hudson. "He will come," said Holmes, watching the fog curl past the window. "He will come because to refuse would arouse suspicion, and because he believes the investigation has stalled with the clearing of Blackwood and Eleanor. He thinks he is safe, Watson. He thinks the brandy did its work, and the grave has kept its secret." He turned to me, and in the lamplight his face held that peculiar, terrible clarity that I had seen upon it only in the final hours of the most serious cases. A look that combined absolute certainty with something that might, in another man, have been called compassion. It is a terrible thing, Watson, to sit across the table from a man and know he is a murderer, but it is necessary. Tomorrow evening, the dead shall have their justice. Chapter 8. The Trap. The dining room of Cedric Holloway's house had been prepared with a care that struck me, under the circumstances, as faintly grotesque. The long mahogany table was laid for 7. Candles burned in the silver candelabra. The good china, white with a blue botanical border, had been set out, and crystal glasses caught the lamplight in small, sharp points of fire. It was the kind of arrangement that suggests celebration, and there was nothing in that room to celebrate. We arrived early. Holmes had spent the afternoon in a state of focused, meticulous preparation that I recognised from previous cases, the arranging of details that appear incidental but are, in fact, the architecture of a trap. He had spoken with Eleanor about the seating. He had confirmed with Lestrade that the inspector would attend in plain clothes and remain unobtrusive. He had examined the dining room himself, adjusting the position of the lamps until the light fell precisely as he wished. The lamp on the sideboard, he told me as we stood in the empty room, must illuminate the table from the left. Crystal refracts lamplight admirably. When a man holds a glass at this angle, he demonstrated, lifting an empty glass to the light, his fingertips are illuminated from beneath. Any discoloration of the skin becomes visible. "You're staging a theatre," I said. "I'm staging an examination," he corrected. "The theatre is incidental." The guests arrived between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, each entering the dead man's house with the particular unease of people summoned to a place where the absence of the host is the most conspicuous presence in the room. Eleanor came first, dressed in black, pale but composed. She had agreed to Holmes's plan without hesitation. Whatever justice required, she would provide. She took her place at the head of the table with the quiet authority of a woman who has decided that grief will not prevent her from acting. The Reverend Blackwood arrived next, moving through the house with the cautious reverence of a man entering a space he associates with conflict. He offered Eleanor a few words of pastoral comfort and took his seat with folded hands and downcast eyes. He had aged visibly in the past week. The exposure of his embezzlement, contained for now to Holmes's knowledge, sat upon him like a physical weight. Viola Trent had prepared the meal. She moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the mechanical efficiency of long habit, laying dishes and filling water glasses, but her eyes were red and her hands were not entirely steady, as she sat, when directed, at the far end of the table and held herself very still. Lestrade took his place near the door with studied nonchalance, wearing a dark suit instead of his customary overcoat. And then Julian arrived. He entered the dining room at 8:05, with an apology for his lateness and a warmth of manner that filled the room like a draught of sunlight. He embraced Eleanor. He shook Blackwood's hand, and he greeted Lestrade with easy courtesy, and nodded to Viola with the familiar kindness of a man who has known the household staff since childhood. He was, in every outward particular, the devoted nephew, grieving, helpful, concerned for the welfare of those his uncle had left behind. He took his seat to Eleanor's right, directly opposite Holmes, and the dinner began. The conversation was strained, as conversations must be when every person at the table is carrying a secret, and at least one of them is carrying a crime. Holmes guided it with the deftness of a conductor managing an orchestra, asking questions that seemed innocuous, steering topics toward areas that made specific people uncomfortable, and watching the reactions with an attention so intense it seemed almost physical. Julian, for his part, performed admirably. He spoke of Cedric with affection that I believe was genuine, or he discussed the fund's future with apparent concern, offering suggestions for new trustees and improved oversight. He comforted Eleanor when her composure wavered. He was everything a grieving nephew should be, and I found myself, even now, even knowing what Holmes had told me, struggling to reconcile the man before me with the murderer Holmes described. But I was watching, as Holmes had instructed me to watch, and I saw things. Julian's hand trembled when he reached for his wine. It was a small tremor, barely perceptible, but it was there, and it was not the tremor of grief. It was the tremor of a man whose nerves are pulled taut as wire. He drank his wine too quickly. The first glass was emptied before the soup was cleared. The second followed before the main course was served. He was not savouring the drink. He was using it as ballast against something that pressed upon him from within. And when Holmes, in the course of a remark about the plants in the churchyard, I mentioned the word monkshood, casually almost in passing, Julian's knife struck the edge of his plate with a small, sharp sound that silenced the table for a fraction of a second. He recovered at once, smiled, apologised for his clumsiness. But the moment had occurred, and I had seen it, and across the table Holmes's grey eyes had seen it too. He laughed a beat too late at Blackwood's attempt at levity. Then he answered a question about his practice with a sentence that began confidently and trailed into vagueness. The mask was holding, but the face beneath it was shifting, and the cracks, hairline fractures in an otherwise flawless performance, were becoming visible to anyone who knew where to look. The main course was cleared, the table was reset for dessert, and then Holmes made his move. "I wonder," he said, in a tone of pleasant recollection, "whether we might toast Cedric's memory with something from his own collection. He was, I understand, a man of particular taste in spirits." He turned to Eleanor. "Miss Holloway, I noticed an 1867 Armagnac on the sideboard in the parlour. Would you permit us a glass?" Eleanor nodded. Viola, at Holmes's gentle direction, brought the bottle and a set of crystal glasses, the good ones, heavy and finely cut, that Cedric had kept for special occasions. She set them on the table, and Holmes poured with his own hand, filling each glass with a measured pour and passing them around. Julian took his glass, and in the moment that he lifted it, his right hand closing around the bowl of the crystal, his fingers illuminated from beneath by the lamplight Holmes had so carefully arranged, I saw it. The staining. It was faint, a yellowish discoloration on the thumb and forefinger, precisely where I had noted it on our first meeting at Baker Street. But under the direct, concentrated light of the sideboard lamp refracted through the crystal, it was unmistakable. It was not the general discoloration of a man who works with herbs. It was specific, localized, and it bore the precise pattern of chemical staining that results from the handling of concentrated alkaloid preparations. Holmes caught my eye across the table. His gaze dropped deliberately to Julian's hand on the glass. Then it rose again to meet mine, and in that look I read everything. Confirmation, a certainty, and a grim, quiet invitation to see what I had been looking at for a week without understanding. I understood now. The yellowed fingers I had noted so casually in my journal. It was not from any legitimate preparation. It was the mark of a man who had handled aconitine, and whose skin still bore the evidence. The room seemed to narrow around me. The candlelight, the crystal, the faces of the assembled guests, all of it receded, and there was nothing in my awareness but Julian's hand upon the glass, and the terrible knowledge of what that hand had done. The toast was drunk. Holmes set down his glass, and in the moment of general movement that followed, glasses returned to the table, napkins lifted, chairs adjusted. He reached across and collected Julian's glass, with a smooth, unhurried motion that drew no attention. He set it aside behind the candelabra, with the casual ease of a man tidying the table. But the fingerprint was secured. The final physical evidence was in hand. Dessert was served and consumed in a silence that had grown heavier with each course. The conversation, such as it was, had dwindled to monosyllables and polite murmurs. Everyone at the table sensed that the evening held something more than dinner, though only Holmes and I, and perhaps Lestrade, who had been watching Holmes with the wary alertness of a man who suspects the ground is about to shift, knew what it was. The plates were cleared. Viola retreated to the kitchen. The candles had burned low, and the shadows in the corners of the dining room had deepened. The house was very quiet. Somewhere in the walls a clock ticked with the steady patience of a mechanism that measures time without caring what the time contains. Holmes rose from his chair. The movement was unhurried. but it drew every eye in the room with the force of gravity. He stood at his place, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair, and he looked at each person at the table in turn, Eleanor, Blackwood, Lestrade, and Julian. His expression was calm, composed, and utterly without mercy. "Before we adjourn," he said, and his voice filled the room with a quiet authority that permitted no interruption, "I wonder if I might share some observations about the death of Cedric Holloway." He paused. "I believe the truth deserves to be heard in the house where it began." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something, a held breath, a suspended moment, the instant before a verdict is delivered. Julian's glass slipped from his fingers. It did not break. It struck the tablecloth and rolled, spilling a thin trail of Armagnac across the white linen like a wound. Julian caught it, too late, and set it upright with hands that were no longer trembling slightly but shaking visibly. "Forgive me," he said. "Clumsy of me." No one spoke. Holmes regarded him for a long moment, a look of such penetrating, unblinking intensity that Julian's eyes dropped to the table and did not rise again. "Not at all, Dr. Holloway," said Holmes. "Not at all." And then he began. Chapter 9, The Revelation. Holmes stood at the head of the table, and every soul in the room was held by him as surely as if he had reached out and taken them by the throat. He began quietly. "On the morning of October the 15th, he said, the groundskeeper of Briarwood Cemetery discovered the body of Mr. Cedric Holloway seated against the family mausoleum. He was 58 years of age, a retired solicitor, a devoted widower, a man of habit and principle. His flask was open beside him. His face was peaceful. The police, upon examination, and determined that his heart had failed in the cold of an October dawn. A natural death, unremarkable, the kind of ending that earns 3 lines in the morning paper and is forgotten by afternoon." He paused and let the silence work. "That is the story that was told. It is the story that was believed. And it is a lie." The room did not move. The candles burned. The clock ticked in the wall with its patient, indifferent rhythm. Holmes reached into his coat and produced the silver flask, monogrammed CAH, its surface catching the lamplight. He set it upon the table with a sound that, in the stillness, was as definitive as a judge's gavel. "This flask," he said, "belonged to Cedric Holloway. He filled it each evening from a bottle of 1867 Domaine d'Ognoas Armagnac, a rare spirit he sourced from a specialist importer. He was, by all accounts, dreadfully particular about his brandy." He looked at Eleanor, who nodded, now her face white. "The flask, when I examined it on the day of his death, did not contain Armagnac. It contained cognac, a common spirit, similar in colour, entirely different in character. Someone had emptied the Armagnac and refilled the flask with a substitute." He unstoppered the flask and set the cap beside it. That substitute was laced with aconitine, the lethal alkaloid of Aconitum napellus, commonly known as monkshood or wolfsbane. Chemical analysis confirmed the poison. After 3 or 4 swallows would deliver a fatal dose. The symptoms, cardiac arrhythmia, respiratory failure, would be indistinguishable from natural heart failure, particularly in a man of Cedric's age, found in the cold. It was a method chosen not merely to kill, but to conceal the killing. This was a murder designed to look like nothing at all. Blackwood crossed himself. Viola pressed her hand to her mouth. Julian sat very still, his eyes fixed on the flask. "The question," said Holmes, "was who? And to answer that question, I examined every person with the means, the opportunity, and the motive to commit this crime." He turned to Blackwood first. "Reverend Blackwood, You quarrelled with Cedric Holloway over financial irregularities in the parish accounts. Irregularities that exist because you have been diverting church collections to pay for your brother's care at Colney Hatch Asylum. You had motive, and monkshood grows along your churchyard wall. But you were at the deathbed of Mrs. Agnes Crowe from 11 o'clock until 5:30 on the night of the murder, confirmed by 3 members of the Crowe family and the attending physician. You could not have been at the cemetery. Additionally, you cannot identify monkshood by sight. You consistently call it larkspur. You are a thief, Reverend, but you are not a poisoner. Blackwood's head bowed. He said nothing. Miss Holloway. Holmes's voice softened fractionally. You inherit your father's estate. You were seen near the cemetery on the night of the death. You argued with your father about money, and you insisted on engaging a detective, which could be read as a killer seeking to control the investigation. But you were elsewhere that night, in the company of a person who can confirm your whereabouts, and your alibi is absolute. Your insistence on this investigation was not the act of a murderer. It was the act of a daughter. He did not name Pemberton. He did not describe the affair. Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she held his gaze with gratitude. Mr. Marsh, you had access to the cemetery, knowledge of Cedric's routine and motive. He was seeking your dismissal. But your own enterprise, the resale of burial plots and the supply of cadavers to medical schools, required Cedric's continued presence. A new trustee would audit the burial records. Cedric never did. His death was the last thing your business could survive. You are a ghoul, mister. Ah, Marsh, but you did not kill Cedric Holloway. Marsh was not present. Holmes had not invited him. But the elimination was delivered for the benefit of those who were, and for the completeness of the record. Mrs. Trent, you had daily access to the brandy flask and knowledge of Cedric's routine. Your bequest was reduced in his recent will, suggesting a possible motive. But the will reduction was proportional. All bequests were reduced equally to fund a charitable addition. But your motive evaporates upon examination, and you were at the Lamb and Flag until 11 o'clock, confirmed by the publican. Your secret is not murder. It is silverware. Viola let out a sound that was half sob and half bitter laugh, and covered her face. "Which leaves," said Holmes, and his voice changed, grew quieter, harder, stripped of every ornament, one person. He turned to Julian. The room contracted. The air itself seemed to thicken. Julian sat in his chair with his hands flat upon the table, and his face, that open, charming, handsome face, had gone the colour of bone. "You visited your uncle at 20 minutes past 8 on the evening of October the 14th, said Holmes. "You left at 10 minutes past 9. In that interval, while Cedric retrieved documents from his study to show you the evidence of your embezzlement from the Restoration Fund, 2,000. £400 stolen over 23 months to cover gambling debts accumulated in the card rooms of Soho. You emptied his brandy flask and refilled it with a cognac preparation laced with aconitine. The poison was derived from monkshood grown in your own conservatory and prepared in a vial that you later smashed and buried in your garden compost." Julian's mouth opened. No sound came out. "Cedric Holloway discovered the discrepancies in the fund accounts," Holmes continued. "He confronted you that evening. He gave you 48 hours to confess voluntarily or face criminal prosecution. His diary entry for that night reads, 'J. coming tonight. God help us both.' That is not the record of a man expecting a pleasant family visit. It is the prayer of a man who loved you and who knew that what he was about to do would destroy you." Holmes reached behind the candelabra and produced the crystal glass Julian had held during the toast. "Your fingerprint is on this glass. It matches the partial print found on the interior threading of the flask stopper, a place you failed to wipe because you did not think anyone would ever examine it. And the chemical staining on your fingers," he gestured toward Julian's right hand, still pressed flat against the table, "is consistent with the handling of concentrated aconitine. It is not the mark of herbal practice. It is the mark of a man who prepared a poison to kill the person who loved him most. He set the glass down. You murdered the man who raised you, Dr. Holloway, and you did it because he gave you 48 hours to confess, and you could not bear the consequences of your own deceit. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever known. Julian did not run. He did not shout. He did not deny it, or rage, or lunge for the door. He sat in his uncle's chair, in his uncle's dining room, at his uncle's table, and he was very still for what felt like an age. Then his shoulders began to shake, and the tears came. Not the restrained tears of the grief he had performed all week, but the raw, wrenching sobs of a man who has been carrying something unspeakable and has finally been forced to set it down. He was going to tell the police, Julian said. His voice was broken, barely audible. Marguerite is with child. My wife, she knows nothing. If I were exposed, the practice, the name, everything, she would have nothing. The child would have nothing. I could not. He pressed his fists against his eyes. I could not let him destroy everything. You destroyed it yourself, said Holmes, the moment you sat down at a card table with money that was not yours. Eleanor screamed. It was a sound I hope never to hear again, the sound of a woman realizing that the cousin who comforted her, who wept with her, who sat beside her at her father's table, had murdered her father and then held her hand at the funeral. Blackwood caught her as she rose, steadying her with shaking arms. Lestrade was already on his feet. He crossed the room with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man performing a duty he takes no pleasure in, and he placed his hand on Julian's shoulder. "Dr. Julian Holloway," he said, "I am arresting you for the murder of Cedric Arthur Holloway." Julian did not resist. He rose from his chair like a man moving through water, slowly, as though the air had thickened around him, and he allowed Lestrade to take his arm. At the dining room door he stopped and turned back. His eyes found Holmes. "He loved me," Julian said. "He loved me, and he gave me a chance to save myself. And I..." He could not finish. Lestrade guided him through the door, and their footsteps receded down the corridor, and the front door opened and closed, and Julian Holloway passed out of the house where he had murdered his uncle and into the custody of the law. Holmes stood at the window, watching the police carriage depart into the fog. The dining room was in disarray, Viola weeping in the kitchen, Blackwood murmuring prayers over Eleanor, the candles guttering in their holders. The Armagnac bottle stood on the table uncorked beside the flask that had carried death. Holmes said nothing for a long time, then very quietly, and to no one but himself, and perhaps to me, "You had 48 hours to save yourself, Dr. Holloway. You chose to spend them preparing poison instead of preparing the truth. That is the tragedy of your intelligence. You were clever enough to kill, but not wise enough to confess." Chapter 10, The Fog and the Fire. The days that followed the arrest of Dr. Julian Holloway were quiet ones, but they were not peaceful. There is a difference between silence and stillness, and what settled over the case in its aftermath was the former, the hushed, bruised silence of people reckoning with what had been done to them, and what they had done to themselves. Julian was held at Holloway Prison. The grim irony of the name was not lost upon the newspapers. Pending trial for the murder of his uncle. He made no attempt to retract his confession. His solicitor entered a plea of guilty and requested leniency on the grounds of extreme emotional distress, though even the most charitable observer would have struggled to characterize the methodical extraction and deployment of aconitine as the act of a man not in command of his faculties. Julian, it seemed, had accepted his fate with the same exhausted resignation with which he had finally surrendered to Holmes. The fight had gone out of him the moment the words left his lips in that dining room, and it did not return, Marguerite was told. I do not know the details of that conversation, and I did not ask. Some sorrows are too private to be chronicled. I know only that she was taken in by her sister in Kensington, and that she did not visit Julian in prison. Eleanor Holloway was left alone with her grief, her father's house, and the knowledge that the man she had trusted as a brother had poisoned the man she had loved as a father. She bore it with the same fierce composure she had brought to Baker Street on that first morning. I visited her once briefly. "Are you to return certain papers?" She thanked me, offered tea, and said very little. Her eyes were dry. I suspect she had moved beyond tears into that territory of loss, where the wound is too deep to bleed. The others scattered in the way that people do when the structure that held them together, in this case the life and death of Cedric Holloway, is removed. The Reverend Blackwood, shaken by how close he had come to accusation, made quiet arrangements to repay the parish funds. He approached the bishop's office and made a partial confession, enough to secure supervised repayment without prosecution. His brother remained at Colney Hatch. Blackwood was diminished but not destroyed. Abel Marsh was dismissed by the new trustees. Holmes reported the cadaver scheme to the authorities, and Marsh faced charges of his own. I do not know what became of him. Viola Trent left service within a week, taking with her nothing that did not belong to her. She found a position with a family in Clapham, and I believe she served them honestly. And Holmes. Holmes was quiet. This, in itself, was not unusual. The conclusion of a case often left him in a state of deflation, the intellectual energy that had sustained him through the investigation, draining away and leaving behind a melancholy that could last for days. But this was different. The silence that settled upon him in the wake of the Briarwood case was not the silence of exhaustion. It was the silence of a man who has seen something that disturbed him, and who is turning it over in his mind not to solve it, but to understand it. On the morning of October the 23rd, 4 days after the arrest, I woke early and found Holmes gone. His coat and hat were missing, and Mrs. Hudson informed me that he had left before dawn without breakfast or explanation. I knew, with the certainty of long acquaintance, where he had gone. I found him at Briarwood Cemetery. The fog was thick that morning, the thickest we had seen all month, and the cemetery existed in a world of its own, sealed off from London by walls of grey vapour that muffled every sound and reduced every shape to suggestion. I walked the familiar path between the crooked headstones, past the yew trees and the weeping angels, and found Holmes standing before the Holloway mausoleum with his hands at his sides and his head slightly bowed. He did not turn when I approached. He knew my step, as I knew his, and the recognition required no acknowledgement. I stood beside him for a time, saying nothing, looking at the white marble and the name carved above the door. The fog curled around us. The graves stretched away in every direction, row upon row. The patient accumulation of lives lived and ended and committed to the earth. It was the kind of mourning that makes the boundary between the living and the dead feel provisional, as though one might, with a wrong step, cross from one world into the other without noticing. "What are you thinking?" I asked at length. Holmes was silent for a moment longer. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet, stripped of its usual precision, its analytical edge, its faint sardonic undertone. It was the voice of a man speaking not to inform or to deduce, but simply to give shape to something he had been carrying. "He loved his uncle, Watson," he said. "That is what makes this wretched. He loved him. And he killed him anyway, because he loved his own comfort more." He paused. The fog moved between the graves like something breathing. There is no poison more lethal than selfishness dressed in the clothes of love. I did not reply. There was nothing to add to the observation that would not diminish it. We left the cemetery together and took a cab back to Baker Street. The fog accompanied us, pressing against the windows, swallowing the streets, and making the familiar city strange and unfamiliar. Holmes sat with his chin upon his chest and his eyes half closed, and I watched the grey world slide past, and thought about Julian Holloway and Cedric Holloway and the terrible arithmetic of a life in which the man who raised you becomes the man who stands between you and the ruin you have made. Back at Baker Street, the fire was lit and the lamps were burning. Mrs. Hudson had laid out a late breakfast, and the sitting room had that particular warmth, amber and close and sheltering, that made it, for all its clutter and eccentricity, one of the most comforting rooms in London. The contrast with the cemetery was absolute, and I felt it in my bones as I settled into my chair. The relief of returning from the country of the dead to the country of the living. Holmes ate little. He sat in his chair with his pipe and stared into the fire, and the silence between us was companionable in the way that only the silence between old friends can be, requiring no justification, carrying no discomfort. It was I who broke it. "Holmes," I said, "I've been thinking about Julian. If he had confessed, if he had gone to Cedric and told the truth and accepted the consequences, he would have faced prison. His practice would have been ruined, his name destroyed, and Marguerite, pregnant, alone, married to a convicted embezzler. The child would have been born into disgrace." I paused. Was there a version of this story in which no one suffered? Holmes considered the question with the gravity it deserved. He removed his pipe from his lips and regarded the fire for a long moment before answering. "No," he said, "there was not. But the suffering would have been of a different kind. Julian in prison is a man who faces the consequences of what he chose. Julian as a murderer is a man who added the destruction of another life to the destruction of his own. Marguerite would have suffered either way. But in one version, she is married to a thief. In the other, she is married to a killer. The distinction matters, not to the law perhaps, but to the soul." He drew upon his pipe. The suffering began the moment Julian sat down at a card table and believed he could gamble with money that was not his own. Everything that followed, the debts, the theft, the confrontation, the poison, was merely the compound interest of that first dishonesty. Each step seemed small, each compromise seemed survivable, and by the time he stood in his uncle's parlour with a vial of aconitine in his pocket, he had travelled so far from the man he intended to be that he could not see the distance he had crossed. He fell silent. The fire crackled. Outside the window, the fog of October blanketed Baker Street, and the city moved within it like a dream of itself, muffled, indistinct, all sharp edges softened. I took up my journal and opened it to a fresh page. The case was complete, the facts recorded, the justice, such as it was, served. All that remained was the final entry, the closing lines that would seal the account and consign it to the shelf where my chronicles of Sherlock Holmes's investigations waited, one beside another, for whatever readers might one day find them. I wrote slowly, choosing my words with care. Behind me, I heard the soft sound of Holmes setting down his pipe and rising from his chair, and then the familiar creak of the case that held his violin. He drew it out, settled it beneath his chin, and touched the bow to the strings. The melody that emerged was not one I recognized. It was slow, wandering, deeply melancholy. Not a composed piece, but an improvisation, as though Holmes were translating something he could not put into words into a language that did not require them. It sounded like grief, not the sharp grief of loss, but the quieter grief of understanding, the grief of a man who has seen once again how easily love becomes its own negation, and who has no solution for this beyond the act of witness. I listened and I wrote, and the fire burned low, and the fog pressed against the windows of Baker Street, and the melody moved through the room like something alive. I wrote the final lines, and so the dead of Briarwood rested once more beneath their stones, and the living were left, as always, to reckon with the choices that had brought them to the graveside. Holmes played on into the night, and I listened. and neither of us spoke again until morning. I closed the journal. I set down my pen. The violin played on.